Hello there, and welcome back to Business Economics. I'm Phil Tomlinson, and I'm a full professor of industrial strategy in the School of Management. I work closely with policymakers at local, regional, national, and at the EU levels on industrial policy, and especially policies to promote regional innovation and regional development. Okay, enough about me, albeit to say, I will be covering the remaining topics this semester in business economics. In this session, we're going to look at the final remaining market structure that you've not yet covered, oligopoly. This is the most commonly and widely observed market structure in the world, and it is essentially the competition of the few. In this session, we will look at three oligopoly models. The Kinked demand curve model, which some of you may be familiar with from A-level economics. Then we'll move on to the Corno model, and then finally the prisoner's dilemma model, which is associated with game theory. In the final part of the session, I've created a short video explainer for you on how we might measure the degree of competition in the market. So please do make sure you take a look at that video as well. Anyway, sit back and in your own time, listen and take some notes as we go through the slides. Okay, to begin, let us have a brief recap of market structures. These are highlighted on the spectrum, which goes from perfect competition, where there are an infinite number of buyers and sellers and competition is very fierce, through to monopoly, where just one firm supplies the market. In the middle, you have monopolistic competition and oligopoly. And the key difference between the two market structures is that in monopolistic competition, you have a very large number of predominantly small firms, each selling a slightly differentiated product. In contrast, oligopoly is characterized by fewness. If there are only two firms in the market, then that is called a duopoly. That is not illustrated here. The key point is that as we move left to right along this spectrum, the degree of price competition falls, and prices will deviate from market marginal cost. And the degree of monopoly power, measured by the so-called price marginal cost margin, increases. And this, of course, is very bad for consumers. So, as you've probably gathered by now, oligopoly is characterized by fewness. Typically, a few firms will dominate the industry, and each will account for a significant share of the market. Oligopoly is the most prevalent market structure in the world. Sometimes markets may be categorized as duopolies, where effectively two firms control the market. For example, Visa and MasterCard pretty much dominate the global payment systems market, while in aircraft manufacture, there are really only two players, Boeing and Airbus. But note that other oligopoly structures are seen in automobile production, petrol, gas, banking, cereals, and so on. The key feature of oligopoly is that of mutual interdependence. That is, the strategic actions of each firm in the market will have an impact on their rivals' sales and profitability, and vice versa. For example, recently in launching its latest PlayStation, the PS5, Sony have decided to match the prices of the new Xbox Series X for fear of losing market share. Similarly, if Apple engage in an aggressive advertising campaign for its latest iPhone, then this is likely to steal customers away from its biggest rival, Samsung, who will likely respond in kind. In other market structures, this type of strategic interaction is largely absent. In monopoly, the firm has no rivals. It is the only firm in the market. In perfect competition, firms are so small relative to the market that its actions can have no effect on its rivals. Similarly, in monopolistic competition, the actions of firms have very small effects on their rivals that they can safely be ignored. What this means is that in oligopoly, strategy and strategic decisions over variables such as price, investment, advertising, and research and development expenditure are important and will have an impact upon the market. Firms are fully aware of this mutual interdependence and must therefore consider the likely reaction of rivals when making strategic decisions. In essence, firms are pulled in two directions. First, they know that engaging in activities to steal market share could lead to an unnecessary price war, or say, an unnecessary advertising war, and this will hurt their profits. Hence, they will be tempted to collude and share the industry profits, possibly acting like a joint monopoly or a cartel. However, on the other hand, and as we will see, collusion can be very unstable, and there will always be a temptation for one firm to cheat. Okay, we now come to the models. But first, a warning. There are no simple solutions or models to capture a firm's strategic decision making. This is because evaluating the potential actions and reactions of rivals over a wide range of strategic variables, such as price, advertising behaviour, and R&D expenditure, is complex. Industrial economists have, however, developed and continue to develop a variety of models that may describe certain oligopoly situations. As mentioned earlier, we will look at three basic models of oligopoly. We will start by looking at the Kinked demand curve model associated with Paul Sweezy. We will then move on to Cournot's oligopoly model, and finally, we'll have a brief introduction to game theory and the prisoner's dilemma. The Kinked demand curve model was once the most widely known model of oligopoly, and indeed, it is still a staple of A-level economics courses. The model itself was developed in the 1930s by an American Marxist economist, Paul Sweezy. His photograph is on the slide. Sweezy was trying to explain why, in the depths of the Great Depression of the 1930s, many oligopolistic markets exhibited a high degree of price rigidity or stability. Recall, this is a time when production costs, notably wage costs, were falling significantly. However, prices in many industries were not falling. They were remaining sticky. Sweezy argued that since markets were largely oligopolistic, then firms were conscious of the actions of their rivals and their likely reactions to price changes. In such cases, firms would see that any price increases they make from the prevailing market price would not be followed by competitors. As a result, they would lose customers. Conversely, any price reductions a firm decides to make from the prevailing market price would be matched by competitors and would not generate significantly more sales. Both measures would lead to a firm losing out on profits. As a result, the demand curve facing a firm under oligopoly is not perfectly elastic. Indeed, as we will see, it is perceived to be kinked. So here we have a kinked demand curve that a typical firm under oligopoly may perceive that it is facing. P star is the prevailing market price, and the firm produces Q star. The portion of the demand curve above P star is relatively price elastic. That means, or implies, that if an oligopolistic firm arbitrarily decides to raise its own price, it sees that competitors will not follow, since they have no motivation for doing so, because these competitors are likely to gain custom by simply keeping their price at the prevailing level. In this case, the oligopolistic firm will lose a significant number of customers if it decides to raise its price. The portion of the demand curve below P star is relatively price inelastic. That means that if the oligopolistic firm arbitrarily decides to lower its price, it sees that competitors will match the price cut, because otherwise these competitors would lose sales and market share. Consequently, the oligopolistic firm will not gain a significant number of customers. It is now evident that each oligopolist in the market finds himself placed in such a position that while on the one hand he expects his rivals to match his price cuts very quickly, on the other hand he does not expect his rivals to match his price increases. Therefore at P star you get a kink in the demand curve. As you can see, The kink demand curve is discontinuous at its kink, and the associated marginal revenue curve is also discontinuous. In other words, it has a broken vertical portion. Recall, marginal revenue is the additional revenue a firm earns from selling one additional unit of output, and this slopes away from the demand curve. That is because revenue increases due to selling an extra unit of output, but falls because the price attained is now lower for every unit sold. Please look back at your earlier course notes if you're unsure. We now add in a firm's marginal cost curve. Recall that profits are maximised when marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Again, check your earlier course notes if you're unsure of this concept. Here we have plotted two marginal cost curves, MC1 and a lower set of marginal costs at MC2. What this highlights is that the price will remain stable so long as the marginal cost curve passes through the gap AB in the marginal revenue curve. Why might marginal costs fall? Well, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, wage costs, aka marginal costs, were falling, but prices themselves do not fall in the same proportion. This meant that the price marginal cost margin, which is sometimes referred to as the degree of monopoly power, actually rose. It also meant that real wages, that is what money wages would actually buy, fell during the Great Depression. And this meant that workers were worse off, and this stifled aggregate demand. And this, of course, in turn exacerbated the Great Depression. Indeed, there is quite a lot of evidence that price-cost margins tend to rise in downturns. For some recent evidence of this, please see the paper by Rob Branston, the late Keith Cowling, and myself in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. Finally, please be aware that if demand changes and shifts to the right or left, then the market price will also change. We've not shown that scenario in this diagram, but you can easily imagine how it might play out. Okay, that is the model, but there are some criticisms you need to be aware of, and these criticisms kind of render the kink demand curve as a rather weak tool for analysing dynamic oligopolistic competition. First, price stability may actually be due to other factors. For instance, in markets where there is collusion, which we'll explore in detail later, there is often concerted behaviour among oligopolists with regard to market price changes, and hence there is no kink in the demand curve at all. Second, the model itself lacks empirical evidence. Indeed, I don't know anybody who has ever found evidence of a kink demand curve ever existing, and that's probably because the model is based largely upon firm perceptions. Third, there's nothing in the kink demand curve theory which explains how the prevailing price is actually determined. In other words, whereas this theory shows why price tends to stay where it is, it tells us nothing about why the price is where it is. Surely the most interesting question is not why prices are sticky in the short run, if indeed they are, but who decides what the price is to be and on what principles. Finally, and just to note, it has been rightly asserted that the explanation of price stability by Sweezy's kink demand curve theory applies only to periods of economic depression and downturns. In periods of boom and inflation, when the demand for goods and services is high and increasing, the price is likely to rise rather than remaining stable.